Opera, originating from the Baroque era in the 1600s with a 200-year period of development into the 1800s classical era. Many types of operatic works were produced from big-name musicians of this period: Monteverdi, Mozart, Vivaldi, Rossini, and Verdi. These names cover only a couple of the opera pioneers. My name is Camden Melick, and I'm here to briefly examine and discuss selected opera works and their composers from the opera eras. For an early era choice from the Baroque genre, Orfeo by Claudio Monteverdi, 1607, was selected due to the influence Monteverdi had within the early opera and Baroque era. The other selection was The Barber of Seville, composed by Gioacchino Rossini and performed in 1816. Both opera works are recognizable by ear. There will be short back-to discussions regarding the contrasting features, the relationship of the composition to the genre of that era, and the composer's influences on the operatic era. Firstly, a discussion must be made regarding the characteristics and musical elements of opera in general. Opera is a form of dramatic music art that uses both vocals and scored instrumentation, often accompanied with a story or opera play. Baroque opera, like with most Baroque works, focuses on the development of emotions using chordal changes and harmonic movements that allow for a pleasing oral experience. Classical music emphasizes music through balanced dynamics, forms, and melodies. A characteristic of the Baroque opera that differs greatly to the classical music is that the music follows the singer. This gives the singer the chance for improvisation and ornamentation. Cadences are not uncommon within Baroque opera. Baroque opera also has a main feature within large compositions that classical opera lacks: the ritornello. The ritornello is a repeated section, a motif or theme, that will appear throughout the whole composition as a bridge between sections or to exaggerate a major scene. In Orfeo, after the toccata at bar 10, the La Musica prologue, a marking for this ritornello appears above the melody. This same ritornello is repeated another 5 times within La Musica, with breaks of 10 bars between them in which the vocals are sung. Within these intervals between the ritornello, improvisation and ornamentation is abundantly present. The aria sings with a rubato feel, and the accompanying instrumentation is light and follows her movements. This is a Baroque characteristic, as it focuses on emotion and the movement of chords, as opposed to the classical, robotic, and complex compositional style. Even though a semibreve is marked at the end of bar 28, the aria implements ornamentation and transitions between close notes on that tone. Ornamentation of this type is mainly a Baroque characteristic, with some exceptions that will be mentioned later. This improvisation is a stark contrast to the classical music and opera. Traditional classical opera is quite uniform in nature. However, classical comic opera, in our case the Barber of Seville, will be discussed. The reasoning for a comic opera choice is that it relates in more ways to Baroque opera than which the traditional classic opera does. Aspects of traditional opera remain within the composition, however. Looking at a most famous cavatina within the Barber of Seville, Largo al Factotum, you can clearly recognize the comic substance. The aria vocals start with a comic melody without lyric or meaning. This repeats until the main aria melody starts after a very sequenced crescendo. This melody of the aria is directly followed by the ensemble. This leaves no room for ornamentation as the line is accompanied. The comic factor of this opera is increased by the dramatic sudden changes within the dynamic range, from piano to accented polyphonic forte. Drastic changes are a common characteristic of classical music as they demonstrate complex compositional devices, and classical compositions tend to stray from emotional styles. Another comic integration within this composition is on page 58 of the schoolbook, where the whole orchestra has a fermata, and the aria just improvises during the pause while letting his voice fall off. This is one of the only occurrences of improvisation within this specific section of the play, and only so due to the nature of the piece being provided at that moment. This is largely a comic factor and common within the comic buffer opera of this time. This is a contrast to traditional styles of classical music and composition, but this is what makes the composition comic in nature, an ultimate contrast that feels out of place instead of the usual consonance. There are many features that make these two operatic works both similar and contrasting. A main contrast within these two works is the flow of the music. For Orfeo, the flow is Baroque in style, meaning that it is consistent to a degree while mainly following the movement of the aria. After the ritornello, the timbre drops into a two-line aria and accompanying string. As a contrast, in Largo al Factotum, the large orchestra creates a large unison and polyphonic timbre. The dynamic range of the Orfeo is quite tame with no sudden changes, and this helps to communicate the Baroque idea of emotional and romantic music. It creates a consistent volume for the vocalist to be expressive with her improvisations. In the Rossini opera, however, there is a lot of sudden changes in volume with an often large dynamic range. There is a stark difference in the complexity of the orchestra arrangement and melodies between the two opera works. In Orfeo, you can see that the accompanying part has sustained notes that add to the chordal tones and exaggerate the chord progression. In The Barber of Seville, you can see the large full score arrangement with bars upon bars of sequencing and fast-moving accompaniment and melodies. This characteristic is clearly classical in nature, as classical music focuses on a balance and exaggeration on the complexity of music. Moving from these specific operatic works, now a quick discussion on the composers themselves. Claudio Monteverdi is a well-known composer of the opera era, and he was considered a pioneer in the Baroque era. His opera is often performed in modern society. Monteverdi was the first to create opera works that have lasted to this day, and he promoted the creation of such large-scale musical arts. Claudio marks the turning point in the Renaissance era to the Baroque era. Meanwhile, Rossini marked the ending of the opera golden age with his many famous opera works, including the famous William Tell opera. Gioacchino Rossini is most renowned for his pioneer work within the comic buffer opera era. Rossini was influenced by famous traditional classical artists and Monteverdi himself. Both composers had a large influence on the development of opera in their respective era. Even today, both composers are heard and their works are recognizable to many. Closing this discussion, I'll provide a summary of the touched upon opera works and their composers. This case task was to analyze and compare an early 1600s Baroque work with an early 1800s classical work to see the changes and influences over the 200-year opera era. The discussed Baroque opera was Orfeo by Claudio Monteverdi and the pioneer of Baroque opera. The discussed classical opera was The Barber of Seville, composed by Gioacchino Rossini, the pioneer of the buffer comic era. These two operatic works are both great examples of opera from their respective eras as discussed. This is Camden Melick, and thank you for listening.